December 13th to December 15th, 1989. I was drunk and under the influence of heavy sedatives. For a couple of hazy seconds, I was blissfully unaware of my situation. There was no research, there was no institute, there was no impending danger. Yet, as my blurry vision sharpened under the harsh light of the bedside lamp, my throat seized up with fear. Konstantin Markarov was standing above my bed. There was a pistol in his hands. He told me, in no uncertain terms, that if I tried to call for help, he would shoot me on the spot. He was doing his best to appear calm, but the pulsing veins on his forehead betrayed his restlessness. He had come into my room to discuss my loyalty, not to Dr. Herkel, but to the Institute as a whole. Markarov broke into my room with a gun to gauge whether I was willing to do the right thing to keep the dark knowledge safe. The quiver in his hands made it very clear what would happen to me if I was deemed unworthy. He asked if I was going to tell Dr. Herkel about his plans. Still paralyzed with fear and sleep and the poison in my veins, all I managed to do was shake my head. He asked if I was going to continue working within the confines of the Institute once Herkel's leadership would be usurped. With the threat of a gun in my face, I wanted to shake my head yes, but my neck refused to move. More research beneath the watchful eye of an organism I couldn't comprehend. The suggestion was far too horrid. I wanted out, and there was no way that I could lie about that. Markarov took my silence for an answer. From the pocket of his coat, he removed a syringe filled with a clear viscous liquid. It was far too dangerous for the Institute to keep me alive, he said. The injection would put me out of my misery peacefully. If I was to reject it, the gun would be considerably more messy. Markarov apologized and leaned over to my shaking wrist. My body refused to move, but I let out a yelp. That yelp quickly turned into speech. I do not know exactly what I said. I was delirious, but I know what I spoke of. I spoke of the cartoons that I've been drawing. I begged Markarov to let me live, to allow me to leave the borders of the Union and pursue a life wholly unrelated to science. My pleas did nothing to stave off the lethal injection, yet when I mentioned that I wanted to create a cartoon about science, Markarov's hand wavered. He asked what the cartoon would be about. I told him. In a hushed whisper, I told him the tale of a scientist that has been festering in my brain for months. It would be a show for children, a show that would make them laugh and appreciate the art of knowledge. It would be a show about men like me and Markarov. But the children would never have to think about the horrid research we were conducting. It would be a show about our lives, but the pulsing darkness of the Institute would be cut out and disposed of. My room is filled with sketches of this scientist, of his friends, of the world he is set to inhabit. Markarov's eyes drifted away from my veins, and for the first time since he broke into my room, he acknowledged my art. He just stood there, a pistol in one hand and a lethal injection in the other, and admired my work. Then, he spoke. His words were seared into my brain. They were my only companion for what felt like an eternity.
"That will be a beautiful show,"
Markarov said.
"That will be a beautiful show, and I hope that one day, once all this darkness is contained, once the world is safe, I hope that one day I will be able to see it. You have my mercy, Vítek, but I still cannot risk you interfering with the unification."
My body was slowly starting to obey my orders. I was able to feel my own weight and move my fingers, yet before I could rise out of bed, I lost control once more. Markarov stuck the needle into my arm and pressed the viscous liquid into my veins.
"This dose will not kill you, but the next hours won't be pleasant."
His voice sounded like far-off thunder. The universe shrunk into a tunneled view of the syringe. Markarov had given me a half dose.
"I wish you luck with your cartoon. The people will need to laugh when this is all over. Glory to the labor."
Somewhere, 1,000 leagues away, I could hear the door to my room close. My body was completely weightless. All that existed was the cracks in the ceiling and the waterfall of blood rushing through my skull. My thoughts slowed down to a crawl. Occasionally, I felt the sensation of movement, as if my limbs were grasping and stomping for something real, but all the sensations of my body were impossibly distant. All I could hear was the rolling thunder in my eardrums. All I could see were the cracks in the ceiling. They looked like bolts of thunder. Through the thick mental fog, I found myself thinking about Adam Bernovsky. The hotel siren sounded as if it had been muffled under a pillow, but the sound tugged at my senses. As the low notes strained on and on, I was dragged from the ether into my body. For a brief moment, the ceiling of my hotel room sharpened into reality, but then a terrible wave of exhaustion misted the world once more. To the quiet shuffling of feet in the hallway, I lost consciousness. I drifted in and out of sleep for the rest of the day. With my neck completely paralyzed, time passed through blinks. The ceiling of my room slowly brightened, and then, under the hum of an outside snowstorm, grew dark once more. Throughout the night, sensation slowly crept back into my fingers and toes. I even managed to crane my neck over to the side. I was still a half-witted corpse glued to the mattress of my bed, yet at least I could see the outside world. Beyond my window was the empty burnt-out panel house in which Moshin once lived. Beyond the cement carcass, there was a forest, far too familiar to me. I watched the ugly vista, trying to gather the strength to get out of bed. What finally launched me off the mattress was more provoked by fear rather than conscious intent. A flash of bright light from the forest in which the Institute is hidden, like a lightning strike but brighter and silent. The moment my window lit up, my body propelled itself backwards as if it instinctively wanted to be as far away from the light as possible. I ended up with my face pressed against the dusty floor, yet even so, I could still see the light. It pulsed long into the night, like some foreign heartbeat growing more and more frantic with each pump, but then, as if the light never existed at all, the room went dark. When I finally managed to rise to my knees, I crawled into the bathroom. I vomited, I urinated, and then, with my mouth feeling like a desert made of dust, drank 7 glasses of water. Quenching my thirst made me feel significantly more stable, but that didn't last. Standing up had made my knees weak. My vision turned to faint static. Fearing cracking my head against the sink, I laid down on the floor of the bathroom. Even on the cold tile floor, I didn't last awake long. I woke from my feverish sleep about 30 minutes before the hotel siren were meant to sound off. Throughout the night, my body had gathered enough strength and balance for me to stand upright. With my knees still weak, I managed to make my way back to the bed. With no clear plan of action, I sat down and stared at the clock. I thought that after the morning call of the Rusalka, I would be able to crawl my way down to the lobby and figure out what had happened the night prior. Yet as I watched the hands of the clock distance themselves from the usual wake-up call, I realized there would be no siren. The hotel was deathly quiet. Outside, the sun was already crawling onto the sky, but the usual groaning of the elevator and shuffling in the hallway was absent. I was anxious to leave the safety of my room, especially since I had no idea what to expect outside, but eventually my stomach demanded me to go get some form of nutrition. 30 minutes after my usual wake-up call, I made my way down to the cafeteria. There were no familiar scientists in the lobby. Aside from a hotel clerk that I had never seen before, I was the only living soul in the brutalist entryway. I had hoped I would meet someone in the cafeteria who could illuminate the situation with Institute, but the eatery was just as empty as the lobby. There were no visitors, yet the unseen staff had laid its usual set of bland-looking food. Starving, I chewed through 4 egg sandwiches and retreated back to my room. Most of my morning was spent pacing around trying to figure out what to do. Markarov had spared my life, but he also did so under the promise that I would never return to the Institute. Walking through that forest to investigate what had happened at the research facility seemed like suicide, and past my wrecked body, I felt a need for self-preservation. Spending the whole day in the confines of my room, however, also felt dangerous. In a need to clear my head and breathe air that doesn't smell like my sweat, I ventured out of the Rusalka. It was an unseasonably warm day. The temperature was still a couple of points below freezing, but the sun was bright in the sky. The street vendors that I used to walk by back in my vagrant drinking days would usually regard me with utter disdain, but this morning, from behind their thick fur coats, I could see the hints of what seemed like smiles. It took me a long time to realize that the army was gone. I visited 3 news kiosks until I found a newspaper that was in a language that I could read, but the search was completely pointless. Lowest milk prices in decade thanks to comrades in Belgrade, was the weekly front page news. No mentions of troop movements, no mention of science facilities. I wasn't counting on detailed information, but I had hoped the journalists would manage to have snuck in at least a hint of what was happening past the censors. They didn't. It was a relatively warm day for the harsh climate I was used to, but the longer I spent on the street, the more I felt a shiver enter my limbs and jaw. I wasn't cold. My body was just shaking through some sort of nebulous discomfort. Making my way back to Rusalka, I started to realize how long it had been since I had last indulged in the syringes that Dr. Herkel used to send over to my hotel room. Before the true horror of withdrawal could dawn upon me, however, I bumped into 2 familiar faces. 2 men dressed in messy patchworks of improvised coats, one with an eye patch fashioned out of a bandage in a plastic bag and the other with a missing hand. They yelled at me, addressing me as Science Man. I recognized the bottle they were drinking from before I recognized my old drinking acquaintances. I gave the vagrants some money, and in exchange, they let me drink from their bottle. The liquor didn't calm the soreness in my arms, but it eased my mind somewhat. Talking to the vagrants also bettered my state. It felt good to speak with people who knew me. We had drunk together before, we had sung songs around the fire. These men were the closest thing I had to friends in the past 2 years. As we emptied the bottle, the 2 vagrants told me of the army's departure. Shortly after sunrise the day prior, all the troops had packed up their tents and left the city in a caravan of trucks and tanks. Obviously, the public was not entitled to explanations of the movement of the military, but there were whispers around the fire that the soldiers were leaving to quell a revolt somewhere up north. The vagrants weren't content on discussing politics at length, however. Soon enough, they started inquiring about me. Where had I been for the past year? Why had I not come to drink with them? Had I seen the blue-eyed old man who used to drink with us? He had disappeared. It is with the last question that I excuse myself from the conversation. The memory of the poor man's fate tore away at any camaraderie from the drinking. What good were friends in a world in which the foreign flesh that consumed the old man's body could exist? The shiver in my limbs strengthened. I started to feel nauseous. As I excused myself, the vagrants insisted I join them in their drinking circle in the near future. I did not accept their offer. Whatever poison Markarov injected into me has run its course, but the paralysis and exhaustion have been replaced with a horrible craving. There were no syringes delivered to my room when I returned, and I feared there never will again. I am certain that the man who provided me with my medicine over the past year is dead. Withdrawal is unavoidable. I cannot draw. I can barely write. All I can do is sleep. All I can do is sleep and hope that the thoughts of the Institute will leave me. "16th of December, 1989. Last night, shortly after I finished scratching out the previous entry, I went to sleep. I spent most of the night drifting between discomforting dreams and fevered consciousness. When I closed my eyes, I was back in the Institute, climbing the stairs up to my lab through an impossible incline. In the moments that I woke, I found myself covered in sweat, yearning for something to quell the burning in my veins. My sleep was one of dazed terror and discomfort, yet as the lights outside died down and the clock struck 12, my night attained a significantly more troubling tenor. Quietly, beneath the deafening sound of my rustling covers, I could hear a familiar tone. The Rusalka's siren. Soon enough, I heard a unified shuffling of feet in the halls. The elevator groaned and coughed as groups of scientists were transported down to the lobby. The People's Institute of Science was still operating, just under different hours. The sleep had not helped my composure. My body was still shivering beneath the force of an unquenchable thirst, but I knew I couldn't leave the city without knowing what had happened to the Institute. Once the elevator was silent for long enough to suggest there were no more passengers making their way downstairs, I followed the group. My daily walks to the Institute were often accompanied with thoughts of dread and physical ailments associated with substance abuse, but that final walk to United People's Institute of Science was the worst of them all. Each step that I took threatened my balance because of the tremors in my feet. The cold midnight air scratched against my throat and imperiled me with coughs that would expose me. I did not do a good job staying hidden, yet the scientists paid me no mind. They simply marched through the forest towards the Institute, as they always had. The guard shack outside of the elevator was empty, yet I still stayed back as the scientists made their way into the building. It wasn't until I was completely certain that they had all entered the Institute that I made my way towards the facility. Touching the large metal doors sent a chill through my spine that rivaled the icy claws of withdrawal. The moment I laid my hand on the door, I knew that an incomprehensible change had taken place. I was no longer standing outside of the United People's Institute of Science. I was standing in front of a building that had wholly transformed at its core. I was standing at the entrance to something insane. Yet I still opened that door. I still walked into that elevator. I knew that nothing good would meet me in the bowels of the Institute, but I also knew I would never rest easy until I found out what had happened. With dread in my heart, I entered the Institute. The ride on the elevator fortified my certainty that the Institute had somehow transformed at its core. Gone was the smooth machinery that transported its passengers in absolute silence. The elevator fought each meter it descended through coughs and groans. When I entered the metal box, there was a noticeable pool of liquid on the floor. At first, I presumed it was simply melted snow that the procession of scientists had dragged in from the outside world, but as the elevator struggled against its invisible blockage, the puddle started to grow. Something from outside of the elevator, something massive, was bleeding into the cramped box. When the doors of the elevator finally groaned open, when I witnessed, my world, it crumbled. I had spent 2 years trying to protect mankind, thinking, hoping, praying that there was a way that our species could be defended from the unknown. But seeing, witnessing, being in the mere presence of that thing, in an instant I knew that we stand no chance. Humanity is nothing but an egg filled with blossoming life and limitless potential. Humanity is nothing but an egg being thrown at a brick wall by a furious god. I slammed the elevator controls like a wild animal trying to get out of a cage. The doors were much quicker to close than to open, but the damage had been done. My mind had been completely shattered. There was no way back from what I had seen. It wasn't laughter. No, it certainly wasn't laughter. None of what I had witnessed was funny. Yet the closest thing that I could compare this sound to was laughter. In response to the mess of meat and bone and arteries that I had witnessed, my throat seized up in sudden barks. The organism had spread its tendrils through the metal scaffolding of the scientific cathedral. All of the doors, all of the labs in which horrid research was being conducted. They were all swallowed up in one massive beating sea of flesh. The United People's Institute of Science is no more. All that exists now is Adam Bernowski's art no longer adorns the Rusalka's halls. I do not know where the paintings have disappeared to, but judging by the heartbreak in the old receptionist's eyes, I imagine they have been burnt. There are no decorations in the halls of the Rusalka, and I feel partially responsible. In reparations, I leave behind my sketches. Maybe a couple months from now, someone will stumble upon this abandoned room. Maybe. Hopefully. They'll find these drawings fit to hang up. All that tied me to this place was my research, and now that the Institute is gone, Now that it is under the rulership of that thing, my research will be taken care of. I have given the Institute far more than just 2 years of my life. I had given the Institute far more than I had to give. It's time for me to retreat back home to Prague. I do not know what to expect. I know nothing of the revolution other than that it happened. My mind is shaken, but I hope, I pray, that I will one day recover. Maybe I'll be able to find a job in the arts. Maybe. Hopefully. I'll be able to put together that cartoon I always dreamed about. I think I'll call it The Adventures of Professor Egghead.